Ever tried hugging frost to sleep? No? For folks like Reeve Tomlin in the winterlocked village of Gracemere, that was daily life. And if you think medieval peasants just cozied up by the fire like characters in fairy tales, you're about to be very, very surprised. Let's peel back the postcard view of a snowy, candlelit English hamlet, no jingling carols or comforting soups here. Picture a scattering of sagging huts, smoke puffing lazily from broken chimneys, snow frosting the thatched roofs like sugar on spoiled bread. From a modern lens, it might seem poetic, a family bundled around a hearth, safe and snug, but the truth? That warmth was a mirage. Behind those wafer-thin clay walls hid a brutal, unforgiving truth. Every breath was a battle against the freeze. While the nobility like Sir Alstan grumbled about drafts in their echoing stone keeps, poor folk like Tomlin had it far worse. Their walls were more like suggestions than protection: straw, clay, and splinters barely glued together, swaying whenever the wind took offence. And forget rich furs and banquet meals. The village folk of Gracemere scraped by on hardened barley cakes and splinters of kindling that might as well have been diamonds. In this world, winter wasn't just weather. It was a slow, creeping predator, always circling, always waiting for the weakest to stumble. So how did they endure it? What hidden tactics kept them from freezing in their patched-up shacks? There was no enchanted firewood or wizard-built walls, only a remarkable cocktail of stubborn tradition, raw creativity, and time-tested survival hacks so clever they'd make modern engineers jealous. This story isn't about the invention of the fireplace, it's about resilience, about people who fought the cold not with power, but with patience. And if you stick around till the end, you'll uncover secrets that turned their crumbling shelters into warm, breathing cocoons. You'll discover how livestock weren't just dinner, but heating systems. How darkness wasn't a fear, but a strategy. And the shocker, the one survival tool peasants had that even the richest barons couldn't buy. In contrast to the icy stone coffins that passed for castles, these humble huts were living things. The walls, made of woven alder branches smeared with a thick mud cow dung mix, weren't exactly 5-star insulation. But here's the kicker, that grimy mix of muck? It was genius. The cow manure, far from being just barnyard waste, was packed with fibrous plant remains that gave the clay surprising strength. As it dried, it didn't crack like a cheap plate it held together, forming a natural, warm barrier that didn't trap moisture like cold, dead stone. And unlike the moisture-choking chambers of lords and ladies, these homes breathed, literally. They let the damp air out, kept mold at bay, and gave the residents a better chance of keeping their lungs in working order. The result? A shelter that was warm to the touch, smelled vaguely of the barn, and most importantly, didn't kill you with damp rot. But they weren't just buildings, these homes were alive. They creaked and groaned with the seasons, their roofs twitched in storms. And their soft walls welcomed not just the family, but a full ensemble of rural freeloaders. Mice nesting in the thatch, spiders tap dancing in the corners, beetles rehearsing under the floorboards. Nature didn't stop at the threshold, it walked right in and made itself comfortable. Every fall, as leaves surrendered to frost, the families of Gracemere would gather like bees around their homes. With wooden buckets of clay mixture, they'd seal every crack, smudge every gap, stuffing moss into the worst holes like peasants playing handyman. This wasn't just maintenance, it was an annual ritual, almost sacred. Sometimes neighbors pitched in, turning it into a mud-slapping party. Laughter, gossip, shared bread all wrapped around keeping the death cold at bay. This wasn't DIY, it was survival by community. To block the cruelest winds, they'd sometimes pack straw mats or even full layers of turf along the house's most vulnerable sides. Dry moss tucked into the rafters, thick reed thatch piled high to trap what little heat they had. It wasn't about making the house pretty, it was about making sure the roof didn't drip cold water onto your dinner or your bed. The magic of these homes lay in their partnership with the land. They weren't built to fight winter, they adapted to it. They blended into the landscape, bowed to its rhythms, and huddled against it. They didn't resist nature's fury, they curled up under it like hedgehogs beneath leaves. But even the most lovingly patched up hut was just an outer skin. The real battleground was inside in the single smoky room that held their entire world. Hilda, Tomlin's wife, cooked stews that tasted like patience and hope over a fire that was more smoke than flame. Their hut, like most in the village, was a one-room wonder. No guest suites, no study, not even a pantry, just 4 walls, a roof, and life. Everything happened in that single space. Eating, sleeping, praying, arguing, laughing, dying. And yet it worked. The tight quarters that would drive a modern city dweller to madness were a weapon against the cold. Unlike the cathedral-sized halls of Lord Alstan's keep, these huts were small enough for every breath, every ember, every steaming bowl of soup to matter. Heat wasn't wasted, it circulated, soaked into every corner, carried on breath and body and spirit. The ceilings hung low, no pointless grandeur, no place for warmth to escape to. Life clustered near the hearth, packed like fireflies in a jar. The table was a lopsided plank, the benches carved from logs. The storage chest doubled as a chair, every piece had to earn its keep. And the air? A wild mix of pungency and poetry, wet wool mingled with burning peat, garlic dangled beside old boots. The smoke curled into every crease of every wall, chasing out the chill and painting the ceiling black. You could taste the warmth and the grit in your teeth. It wasn't silent, either. Babies wailed. Old men mumbled stories half asleep. Fire popped. Floor creaked. Mice scurried with the confidence of landlords. And still, through it all, a warmth not just of temperature, but of togetherness. Yes, it stank. Yes, it smoked. Yes, privacy was a joke, but all of that faded beneath the simple truth. Warmth was survival, and tightness-closeness was the cost of it. In these huts, every emotion had witnesses. There were no whispered secrets, no doors to slam, no corners to sulk in. A fight echoed through every straw beam. A laugh lifted the whole house. If you loved, hated, grieved, or hoped, you did it in front of everyone. And that forced a kind of peace, a truce born of necessity. You either grew into one another or cracked apart. The structure itself, as simple as it looked, was an act of pure logic. Large houses? Useless in winter unless you had cartloads of wood and time to burn. Peasants knew this instinctively. Bigger meant colder. More space meant more suffering. So they didn't build homes, they built cocoons. And in those cocoons, they endured. This wasn't weakness. This was genius. This was human survival wrapped in straw and held together with love, soot, and manure. In just a few cramped meters, every shade of human life played itself out: joy, grief, laughter, and whispers, all tangled up in one tight little room. There were no private corners, no extra chambers to escape to, and when the winds outside howled like a pack of wolves, families like the Bramblewoods didn't scatter. They huddled closer. They leaned in. And in the center of it all, radiating both heat and hope, was the fire. But not just any fire. In a nobleman's estate, a fireplace was just another display of wealth, an architectural flex to show off marble or metal. In a peasant's hut, though, the open hearth was the soul, the glowing pulse of their entire world. It wasn't merely for boiling turnips or roasting stray bits of meat. It was warmth, light, a beacon in the darkness, and a kind of divine presence. The entire rhythm of life pulsed to its flickering beat, especially in those long, suffocating months when the sun all but vanished and the cold laid siege to the land. The hearth's placement wasn't random. Built directly on the dirt floor in the middle of the hut, it radiated heat equally in every direction. That made it a democratic flame. Everyone could sit around it, and everyone did. But this clever positioning was also a gamble. An open flame surrounded by dry straw, wooden beams, and woolen cloaks was the ultimate daredevil's trick. One gust of wind, one flying ember, and your warm shelter could turn into a torch of death. No one slept soundly without keeping one eye open for the fire's hiss and pop. Above the fire, a blackened iron hook or dangling chain held a hefty pot that never truly stopped bubbling. Thick broths and herbal stews cooked low and slow, steaming up the air with scents of garlic, smoke, and boiled roots. This wasn't just food, it was moisture. With the fire drying the room into a brittle crisp, that bubbling cauldron added back just enough wetness to keep lips from cracking and lungs from shriveling. The fire was wild, but the villagers had tamed it with rhythm. The smoke didn't politely exit through a chimney. Instead, it made its way up through a jagged hole in the thatched roof, thick, black, and constant. It left soot stains everywhere, but no one complained. That same smoke served multiple purposes. It dried out the wet straw roof, killed off sneaky bugs, and when food was available, smoked meat or fish into long-lasting rations. Hams and trout would hang like shadows above the fire, soaking in the pungent air like warriors armoring up for winter. It was around this fire that life happened. Grandmother Alice told stories so old no one knew where truth ended and legend began. Her voice crackled like the fire itself, telling of frost spirits and sun-chasing foxes. Children sat in half silence, fidgeting but listening. Mothers showed them how to spin thread with shaking fingers. Men leaned in with tired shoulders, murmuring about the upcoming grain trade or how the neighboring village had lost 3 goats to wolves. This wasn't just a gathering place, it was the stage where the great saga of their lineage was written, line by line, breath by breath. And nightfall didn't end it, it only deepened the bond. The hearth's glow pushed back against the literal and emotional darkness. That small flicker kept fear at bay, warmed tired limbs, and whispered, "You're still alive." It never went out, not fully. Matches didn't exist. Starting a fire from scratch meant flint, steel, effort, and luck. But beyond practicality, superstition gripped their hearts. The fire was sacred. Letting it die was like inviting doom into the home. Every night, Eldrick would bury the red coals beneath ash, smothering them just enough so they'd smolder until dawn. This method, known as cover fire or couvre-feu in the old French tongue, wasn't just clever, it was magical. To wake up and find warm coals was to know the spirit of the house still lived. If the fire died, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a cursed omen. People feared that the home's protective soul had left them, exposing them to the chaos outside. So the fire was tended like a beloved pet, fed scraps of wood, shielded from drafts, talked to like a friend. It wasn't fire, it was family. Even the ash had a job, nothing was wasted. That grey, powdery residue went into the garden as fertilizer, into pots for scrubbing dishes, into hair as makeshift shampoo. Mixed with water, the lion ash broke down grease and grime. It was the closest thing to soap many ever saw. Stones heated in the flame became makeshift griddles. On them, barley cakes sizzled while root vegetables blackened in the embers, skin on, smoke-flavored. The hearth was less of a fireplace and more of a one-stop survival lab. But even a faithful fire couldn't do it all. For true protection, the villagers armored themselves with whatever the land allowed, and they wore it like proud survivors. Not in jewels or embroidered robes, but in wool and straw, stitched together through aching hands and relentless effort. Their defense against the icy world came in layers. First, a coarse linen shirt, stitched tight and worn smooth with time. Over that, 1 or 2 tunics of scratchy, uncolored wool. Not fashion-forward, but function-perfect. Wool, they knew well, was a kind of miracle. It breathed, warmed even when wet, and clung to heat like it was hoarding gold. Over the shoulders fell a thick, hooded cloak, woven dense to fend off sleet and frost. The key to warmth wasn't just the cloth, it was the layers. Loose-fitting and bulky, the clothing trapped precious air between each layer, building tiny walls of insulation. And though the garments looked shapeless, they moved with purpose. They didn't restrict, they protected. But this wardrobe wasn't bought, it was earned through months of sweat and planning. If the Bramblewoods were lucky, they had 2 or 3 sheep. Springtime meant shearing, and that wool would be scrubbed, combed, and spun by hand, mostly by the women. Hours turned into days at the spinning wheel, fingers raw, backs hunched. They'd spin coarse fibers into thick yarn, then press it into cloth on wooden looms that creaked with every push. This wasn't just textile production, it was alchemy. Every meter of homespun was a small fortune in effort. Their clothing wasn't just warm, it was survival stitched into every thread. One tunic might be passed down 3 generations, patched and repurposed, each tier telling a story. And that same dedication extended to bedding. Piles of straw stuffed into sackcloth made rough mattresses. Woven woolen blankets wrapped families like shields. And when warmth faded, they didn't reach for another log, they pulled in another body. These weren't poor solutions, they were brilliant ones born of desperation and wit. They were reminders that you didn't need gold to outwit the cold. You needed instinct, community, and the will to turn scraps into shields. The Bramblewood family's clothes didn't just shield them from frostbite, they told the story of their labor, every patch a chapter, every stitch a sacrifice. Their feet, wrapped in thick woolen socks or twisted cloth, were slipped into bark-tough shoes stuffed with straw or dried moss. Luxury didn't live here, only function. When night fell and the fire whispered its last flickers, the family didn't undress. They layered their day clothes over themselves like makeshift blankets, every thread holding tight to the body's heat. And no, those clothes didn't smell like lavender fields, far from it. Washing garments in winter was seen as risky, even foolish. Not just because drying them was nearly impossible, but because the raw wool still held onto natural lanolin, a fatty substance that made the material water-resistant and surprisingly warm. To scrub it out would be to scrub away their only shield, so they lived in smoky, stiff, sweat-soaked tunics that crackled when folded and smelled like a barn in July, but they were warm. And in a world where comfort was a distant cousin to survival, that counted more than anything. Their bedding was just as ruggedly brilliant. No plush mattresses or feather-stuffed quilts, just thick sacks brimming with straw, or if luck smiled, with dried heather or ferns. Straw, thanks to its hollow nature, trapped heat like a sponge and insulated against the cold earth floor beneath. It wasn't soft and certainly not glamorous. It was itchy, sometimes sharp, and full of little roommates, fleas, mites, and nameless crawlies. But when the alternative was frost, numbed limbs or worse, a little itching felt like a bargain. Blankets, if they owned any, were coarse woolen throws, stiff as bark and twice as scratchy. Many didn't even have those. Instead, they curled up beneath old sheepskins, goat hides, or anything that resembled insulation. Often, the entire family, parents, children, and even Granny Alice collapsed onto a single straw mattress. They didn't do this just for bonding, they did it for heat. The science was instinctual. More bodies meant more warmth. Children, more fragile than anyone, were tucked between adults protected by the warmth of others, like coals kept alive in the center of a fire pit. This system of survival, simple yet brilliant, didn't end with clothes or beds. The very layout of the home was crafted to outwit the elements. The main enemies? The frigid dirt floor and the vicious wind that slipped in through every possible crack. The floor was never wooden, it was just earth, cold, wet, and merciless. To fight it, the villagers blanketed the ground with thick layers of straw or reeds. This layer soaked up moisture, trapped heat, and offered a thin barrier against the chill. In winter, they piled it on even thicker, rarely replacing it. It might have been unsanitary, a breeding ground for bugs and bacteria, but in those months, nobody was chasing cleanliness, they were chasing survival. And yes, the smell wasn't for the faint-hearted. Imagine rotting straw, wood smoke, old stew, and the unmistakable tang of livestock all mingling in one tight space. Still, that stench carried the scent of life of people doing whatever it took to endure. By spring, the straw had decayed into rich, compostable muck-perfect fertilizer for the next season's crops. Nothing went to waste. Even the mess had meaning. Then came the windows, or rather, the nearly non-existent ones. Glass? Not a chance. The few tiny holes carved into the walls were more risk than luxury. Each one was a potential passageway for winter's bite. During the cold months, these slits were sealed tight with wooden shutters. Every crack was packed with moss, ashes, or scraps of cloth. Some used sacks filled with straw, shoved into the gaps like ancient insulation foam. For those who needed just a sliver of light to work by, there were poor man's windows, genius little inventions made from oiled parchment or, believe it or not, stretched and dried bull bladders. These strange panes let in a jaundiced, cloudy glow, like sunlight filtered through an old bottle, but more importantly, they kept the cold out while allowing just enough brightness to spin thread or sort beans. And that darkness? It wasn't a burden, it was a shield. The Bramblewoods, like their neighbors, knew instinctively that every ray of light brought with it a leak in their heat shield. So they embraced the shadows. They lit their lives with the glow of embers, the flicker of tallow candles, or more often nothing at all. They moved slowly, deliberately, by muscle memory and faith. This absence of light gave a strange comfort, protection from cold, from judgmental eyes, and from the vast, merciless world outside. Even the door was fortified like a castle gate. Low, narrow, built to keep drafts from sliding in, it was hung with heavy curtains made from hide or thick woven fabric. The entrance had a double defense system. First the outer door, then the curtain. This created a crude vestibule, a two-stage protection that kept icy blasts from barging in. The threshold itself was raised, forcing that creeping ground cold to stop and think twice. All of this, the clothes, the floor, the walls, the curtains, transformed the hut into something more than a shelter. It became a womb, a sealed cocoon, cut off from the frost-bitten world where life clung on, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. But even this bunker of warmth would be useless without fuel, not just for fire but for the people themselves. The human body, in cold, is a ravenous engine. It burns fuel faster, hungrier. So food in winter wasn't about indulgence, it was about ignition. What the Bramblewoods ate mattered as much as what they wore. The hero of their table was pottage, a thick, bubbling soup that began its life at sunrise and survived until bedtime. Into the iron pot went anything and everything: barley, split peas, dried beans, turnips, parsnips, rutabagas, onions, the tough, stubborn vegetables that laughed in the face of frost. It wasn't gourmet, but it was gold, hot, filling, packed with the kind of dense calories that gave the body strength to resist the cold, slow pull. Meat was rare, but after autumn's harvest, they slaughtered what animals they couldn't afford to feed through winter, mostly pigs, sometimes older sheep. The meat was salted, smoked, or dried, then doled out cautiously. A sliver here, a bone there, enough to add richness and life to the stew. Even a dab of fat turned bland porridge into something worth cheering for. Bread, dense and dark, made from rye or barley, was tough on the teeth but generous in energy. It was dipped in chowder, soaked in broth, chewed with intention. Nothing was mindless. Every bite was chosen. And then there was ale low in alcohol but high in warmth. Brewed from grain and often infused with herbs or honey, it was drunk warm, especially in winter. It was drink, medicine, and comfort in one humble cup. The art of winter eating wasn't just about recipes, it was about ratios, planning, and resisting temptation. Every peel, every bone, every stem had a second purpose. Broths were made from scraps. Peelings fed goats. Summer's dried herbs brought life to winter's greyness. Feeding the family till spring meant thinking like a chess master. One wrong move could spell hunger or worse. But none of these tricks, not the food, not the fire, not the clothes, could compete with the most bizarre and surprisingly brilliant winter survival hack of all: living with livestock. Yes, you heard that right. In a world where temperature could be the difference between life and death, the Bramblewoods knew a secret. Cows are basically space heaters with hooves. Many peasant homes were built like long halls, humans on one end, animals on the other, sometimes separated by a rickety wooden divider, sometimes by nothing at all. When the freeze came, they brought the livestock indoors. Cows, sheep, goats, and the occasional grumpy pig bedded down beside the family, and no one found it strange. Because animals radiate heat. A single cow gave off enough warmth to make the room several degrees hotter. That could be the difference between frostbite and fingers, between shivering and sleeping. And yes, it stank. It buzzed with flies and clung with ammonia, but the warmth, that was real. Even the manure pitched in releasing methane and creating a thick, warm compost floor. Come spring, that slop would be gold in the garden. More than that, it was security. The wolves couldn't get your goats, the thieves couldn't sneak off with your prize sow, and milking didn't require a frostbitten hike to the stable. Everything you needed was within reach, noisy, smelly, and breathing. The Bramblewoods didn't think of this as odd. They thought of it as brilliant, because it was. And they knew. Generating warmth was only half the battle. The next challenge? Keeping it. In the heart of every Bramblewood hearth, fire reigned like a fragile god, vital, temperamental, and always hungry. And in the punishing grip of winter, that fire needed one thing above all: fuel. Not gold, not silver, just fuel. Simple logs, dry sticks, maybe a ball of moss. But in a world where forests belonged to lords and laws were written with blades, even fuel was a privilege. Managing this resource was an art, passed down like sacred scripture. Firewood was life, and the trick wasn't just collecting it, it was preserving every last ember like it was the last breath in a drowning man's lungs. They used it sparingly, almost reverently, stretching every coal as far as it would go. The Bramblewoods couldn't just chop down trees. That was the Lord's forest, and trespassing meant punishment often bloody and public. What they could gather was dead wood, fallen branches, dry twigs, forest crumbs. Really, it wasn't enough, so they adapted. Peat became a savior in swampy areas. Dug up in summer, cut into blocks, dried in the sun, these earthy bricks burned slow, hot, and smoky. Not pleasant, but priceless. And when even peat ran dry, there was Kizak, a peasant's miracle. Dried dung, yes, but pressed tight and baked in the sun, it crackled with unexpected heat. It reeked like a barn fire, but in a snowstorm, no one complained. The key wasn't collecting fuel, it was never letting the fire die. Rekindling flames with flint and iron took time, sweat, and luck. So they smothered embers under ash every night. Not to kill them, but to keep them alive, barely glowing, barely breathing. At dawn, they'd scrape back the ash, whisper dry straw onto the coals, fan gently with a reed mat, and just like that, fire returned. This nightly ritual, called the cover fire, was as much spiritual as practical. Every ember mattered. If a quick stew needed cooking, they didn't stoke the whole hearth. They used a handful of coals, puffed up and caged under a single pot. Coals were scooped into clay jugs and tucked under beds to warm toes. The fire was no longer a single flame, it became many, scattered, living in every shadow. This truly was survival science, not of chemistry or engineering, but of desperation, discipline, and memory. Every child learned it before they could walk. It was as sacred as prayer and more reliable. But beyond fire tricks and dung bricks, the genius of the peasants' survival came in the very design of their homes. What looked like a crooked clay box to outsiders was, in fact, an energy-efficient masterpiece crafted by generations who knew exactly what winter could do to the unprepared. Their huts were purposefully small, like burrows. A low ceiling meant heat didn't rise and vanish. The entrance was a narrow stoop, almost crouch-worthy, not because they were primitive, but because they were smart. The smaller the hole, the smaller the draft. If they had the land to choose from, they positioned their homes carefully, not for aesthetics, but for survival. The thickest, blankest wall faced the brutal northeast winds. Windows and doors, what few there were, faced south, towards sun and shelter. Some homes were dug halfway into the earth, using the ground's constant temperature like an ancient geothermal trick. Warmer in winter, cooler in summer. Genius in its simplicity. The materials? They used what the land gave: clay, straw, wood, turf, local and effective. Their houses didn't sit on the land like burdens, they rose from it like plants. Not intruders, but participants. In contrast to the towering, lifeless castles, these huts were part of the earth's rhythm. They lived, breathed, and aged like the people inside. But even the smartest house, the sturdiest door, the warmest cow dung couldn't save someone alone. The real magic, the most powerful survival strategy of all, wasn't fire or fur or thatched roofs, it was people. The Bramblewoods survived not because they were tough, but because they weren't alone. In their village of Kettlebrook, no one made it through winter solo. It was the strength of the group that mattered, a woven net of favors, rituals, and silent agreements that caught everyone before they could fall. Firewood gathering was a community effort. If one man found a trove of dry branches, he didn't hoard it, he shared it. If a neighbor's hut lost part of its roof in a storm, others showed up with straw and tools, not out of charity, but necessity, because next time it could be their roof. If the elder Mavis ran low on food, 3 families brought her bowls of soup. If Farmer Tom lost his cow, others lent their goat. Babies were watched communally. The sick were treated with potions passed hand to hand. You couldn't afford to hold grudges. You couldn't afford isolation. In Kettlebrook, together was the only way forward. During the long black evenings, everyone gathered in the warmest hut, usually the Bramblewoods. The space was tight, the air thick, but it buzzed with life. Women spun wool together, sang songs about old kings and new gossip. Men carved tools, shared stories, or simply sat there silence as valuable as their presence. Laughter wasn't rare. Hope wasn't either. And then came holidays. Not like we know them, no glitter, no gluttony, but still, they mattered. On Midwinter Eve, the entire village gathered for one potluck meal. Whatever they had, they brought. Roots, salted meat, rough bread, even a jug of warm ale if someone was generous. For one night, no one starved. For one night, they remembered what survival was really for, to keep the story going. Even in daily routines, collectivism showed. One clay oven baked bread for 3 families. One well drew water for 8. One loom made tunics for many shoulders. The system wasn't perfect. Arguments broke out, tempers flared. But beneath it all was a shared understanding. No one gets through this unless everyone does. Their community wasn't an accident. It was a machine, a living organism of give and take, of mutual protection and shared suffering. And in the worst moments, when food ran low, when frost cracked the walls, when death knocked, it was this invisible bond that mattered most. Not wood, not walls, but the human heart. So if you think medieval peasants were helpless, think again. Their winters weren't fairy tales. They were bone-deep tests of endurance. But through tricks both humble and profound, they built warmth from nothing. They made clay breathe. They turned dung into heat. They wore straw like armor and used darkness like a blanket. They stretched barley into banquets and shared silence like gold. But above all, they survived through each other. Because genius isn't always found in books or castles. Sometimes it's in knowing that your neighbor's survival is your own. And that real warmth doesn't just come from fire, it comes from people. If this journey into forgotten resilience moved you, don't forget to follow or subscribe the channel. There are countless more untold stories of ancient ingenuity waiting just ahead.